And welcome, or welcome back, maybe some of you. Such a pleasure to have you all here, and we should probably stop sharing at this point because the only thing you see is the black screen and nothing else. So stop sharing now. Excellent. So welcome back, everyone. What a pleasure it is to have you, and what a pleasure it is to have Kevin with us in the house. Just a few words about Kevin before Kevin jumps in, because we have only 1 hour and we could speak about CSS for 762 videos, as we will see in a moment. Kevin, well, there is one thing you need to know about Kevin. Kevin loves CSS, right? To the point that he even has style sheets written all over his t-shirt, because why not, right? And Kevin is not very shy of camera, I should say, because Kevin at this point has recorded 762 videos, 62, right, Kevin? Yes, 62. 99.9% of them are on CSS. So we have a lot to talk about today. And a few is like, one of them is an intersection observer, which is unusual given the nature of the wonderful, wonderful YouTube channel that Kevin hosts. But Kevin is an educator, and he believes in CSS, and he believes that we can actually do good things with CSS, which I think we all believe, right? And also wants to help people around the world to do that, just that. Also has wonderful newsletter and also has wonderful online courses, which I highly recommend. Also will be joining us in New York when we're going to have our little Smashing Conf. So I'm very, very happy to have you today with us, Kevin. First of all, Kevin, how are you today?
Yeah, I'm doing wonderful. I'm excited to be here. This is awesome. It's an honor. Thank you.
Oh, that's a pleasure. For those of you who were kind of coming here for the very first time, the nature of this wonderful Smashing Hour is very simple. We're here to hang out. I do have, of course, questions prepared, but my questions are not important as your questions are. I'm very excited to see your questions, and it's perfectly fine to raise your hand. Virtual probably going to be better than on camera because I probably won't be able to see that. So I can bring you up and you can ask questions directly, or you can also write in the chat if you desire. You can also share the screen and whatever. It's a very friendly environment, right? But maybe before we start, just to kind of initiate the conversation, Kevin, I have to ask, like CSS, it seems like it's impossible to catch up everything everywhere at the same time. How do you make sense of it all? Do you have like a keep track of everything that's going on in a fancy Notion document? How does it work for you?
That'd be a really good idea. I should work on that. No, I don't know. I just sort of try and keep up with everything as much as possible through following smarter people than me and seeing what they're talking about, and then playing around with it myself. But yeah, these days people ask me a lot like how to keep up with things, and I'm like, I basically do this full time now and I'm having trouble keeping up with a lot of the new stuff. So for anyone who's like, there's just so much going on right now, it's okay if it seems like a lot. Yeah.
Mm, right. Okay. Well, maybe actually looking into what has been happening. Right. For those people like, I don't know, me maybe, or some other people who have been not necessarily like looking every single day or every single week about what's happening in CSS. Like, sure, we had these big, big, big changes coming up with grid and then eventually subgrid um, and we also have container queries and all the magic Cascade layers and all the magical things. What would you say are some of the really important things that really changed CSS in many ways? Like let's say last year or last 2 years.
Yeah, so container queries definitely would be one of those things. I think it both, for those who don't know, it's like a media query, but based on the parents or the defined container size, which would probably often be the parent. So you're not looking at the viewport, you're looking at where the element is living or that thing is living, which makes life a lot. We're in a component based world these days, so that makes a lot of sense. And I think it changes things a little bit. And then also what that's bringing in, because we're getting with that, we get container query units. So instead of viewport units, the query units, those are amazing. With that, we're also getting style queries. So it's not quite there yet, but that's on track. It's part of the same spec where you can style things based on the styles of where it's living. So like, is the background purple here? Well, then the children's text will be a different color or whatever. And there's a lot more than that. The has selector is, I think, something that people were asking for forever. So it's basically a parent selector. and it can go, you can do different things with it. But that was one of those things, I think a little bit like custom properties, where it's like, oh, that's cool, we have variables in CSS now. But then you start seeing like, oh, wait, this is different from variables in a preprocessor. It changed the game. Like the way custom properties work can change the game a little bit, and has to the way that you can use it to select as a parent selector, but you can also then use it as a sibling selector, because you can go sort of, does the parent have this? Yes, it does. Well, then the siblings of this element will be different. It gets a little bit more complicated. We have nesting that's coming around now too, but that's a little bit more of like dev experience rather than like this feature that will change what we can accomplish. But I think even there, actually, I just saw a tweet yesterday by Leah Veru looking at how you can use nesting to do if-else statements. And I'm like, oh, that's interesting. Where you're basically saying like, you can use the not and then the parent selector, which is the ampersand. And then so it's saying if the parent doesn't have that, you can sort of, choose like if this, then this. Anyway, some stuff there. But yeah, there's probably some other things too. But I think the has container queries are probably the two biggest ones.
Oh, that's interesting. Maybe also to just kick off a conversation here. I think I'm not trying to be provoking, but it's just interesting. So I think it was maybe a couple of months ago when State of CSS 2023 came out. And it has a lot of interesting things. I'm actually going to drop a link here for everyone to explore, just in case you didn't have a chance to do that. One thing that really surprised me in all of it was not the usage of some of the CSS features, but there was a question that was asked around what percentage of your work is CSS, right? And I would expect that given this just immense explosion, basically, of all the features that we have for CSS, that many people would be spending a lot more time with CSS rather than less. What was actually quite surprising to me is that to most people, now that I look at it now, actually I could maybe start sharing the screen. Maybe I'm reading this wrong though, so that could be an option too. Let me just share the screen again here, right here. So basically what we're looking at here, this is what they call the CSS versus JavaScript balance. How do you divide your time between writing CSS, including HTML markup, and JavaScript code, right? And so I guess here we're looking at like a majority being somewhere here, 50-50 or 60-40 towards CSS of those people who reply to that, which means that people who are writing CSS also now have to or write JavaScript, right? And I'm wondering what your take on this is, Kevin, like in general, because I mean, I would assume that, again, given just the amount of work that we now have to do with container queries, and I think also rebuilding many things that we've been building maybe with floats back in the day, right? That we should be doing more CSS rather than less CSS. Do you think that's true, or do you think it's not?
I think that, yeah, I think when there's a split between them, and again, you sort of have to do a little bit of something and a little bit of the other one, no matter I think what role you're in. But I think what happens is a lot of the time CSS becomes this thing that people are saddled with a little bit. At least that's my experience with like, one of the frustrations people have is like they just want to hack away at some JavaScript stuff, whatever it is. And then they're like, well, I also have to write the CSS to make it look the way that my designer wants it to look, or something like that. And it's sort of this extra task in something that they're not super comfortable in, but they just have to do it. So I think that's what part of that is. And I do think that with the rise in complexity of CSS, I 100% agree with you. I think it would be a really good thing, and I've been saying this for a while, that if having very small focused teams that focus on the CSS side, and then you have the JavaScript people focusing more on that, I think is a good thing. That just because when you have like 10 different people that are all not super comfortable working in CSS, all contributing to it, I think that's one of the things that also leads to a lot of the frustrations and the maintenance issues and all the different things that you can run into. Whereas if you have less people that's their job, I think it makes everybody's life a little bit easier.
Absolutely. Yeah, I do agree with you on that there. And of course, as I try to prioritize questions from the audience, I'm going to jump right in because we have a question from Johannes here in the chat, wondering how many levels of custom properties are you stacking, Kevin? Reuse properties in in properties, for example, to translate the tiers of tokens in design system to CSS or for color calculations?
Right. So I'm still a little bit old school in that I guess I still, if it's a larger project, I'm still using SAS or SCSS. So I usually have all of the token level stuff as SAS variables, just because those, if you don't use them, they don't actually get compiled into finished CSS. And I just find that side easier. So I go from, I use maps to sort of make all of the tokens, and then loops that go through those that turn those into custom properties for the ones that you need or that you're actually using in the project. So that's sort of how I handle it. If it was a smaller, if I'm doing a personal project or something where I don't need to go to that level of detail, then I would probably just have it all within custom properties, and still just do sort of my basic tokens, map those over to more semantic stuff, and go from there.
Mm-hmm.
I think
Okay.
that's fine. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So dear friends, of course, I just wanted to remind everyone, so that's a session for you to bring your questions, not necessarily me. So feel free to raise your hand or write in the chat if you desire, if you wish. That's not a problem at all. I'd be happy to bring you up. I do have a question though. Okay, I do have a question though. And just a couple of weeks ago, I had a wonderful conversation with a JavaScript developer. And I don't mean it like saying, oh, JavaScript developers, we are on the bright side of things. And they, oh my God, they. No, no, no. But it was interesting because what he brought up was a very interesting point, namely, well, if you have a design system in place and you have your components laid out and it's all beautiful and you kind of maintain them over time and you extend your family and you add more components and so on, then you kind of end up doing less CSS work, right? Then if you actually build up or rely on an existing thing, like let's say Tailwind, then you need to do even less CSS, right? And so you then end up doing something else. This kind of also ties in with what I was telling earlier. But then also, he was actually very unhappy about this article that came out, I think, a couple of months ago from Tero Pirinen. I'm going to drop it in the chat about Tailwind versus semantic CSS, right? I'm going to share the, I mean, I'm really all into sharing today. Well, the screen at least, right? So that was this one. And that was interesting because it was a comparison where you actually take the same websites, well, two websites with identical design, and build one with Tailwind and the other with semantic CSS. And it seems like over the last few years, there was a very strong movement towards more semantic, more like smaller CSS, like really almost getting away from Tailwind, but there is still a very strong, I would say, prevalence or interest in Tailwind. So I'm wondering just where are we now? What do you think? Yeah, like, is it? I see a lot of people being very much pro Tailwind, and then you get the camp of people being really very much against it. And again, it's just a tool. As long as it's, you know, the output is clean and optimized, that's great. But it's a bit difficult maybe to make things semantic. I mean, you can with Tailwind, but it's probably difficult. Oh,
Yeah.
James has strong opinions.
I think you sort of hit the nail on the head there. I think that it's sort of, we have two camps a little bit. And one thing that, speaking of the state of CSS survey, one thing that surprised me in it, they asked about, it was usage of Tailwind. And just based on like social media and everything that I'm a part of, it just seems like everybody's using it and talking about it. Or, and then you get a few people that are more line in the sand against it. But it looks like it's actually, so that's retention. If you switch that to usage, there's a tab at the top of the chart, down a little bit.
Is it? Oh yeah, this one.
Yeah. So I was surprised to see like Tailwind's still rising, but it's slowing down a little bit.
Yeah.
And maybe I'm wrong and the trend will completely change next year, but I have a feeling it's sort of found the people who like it and who like it a lot. And then you get the opposite camp where it's like, no, I'm never going to write anything using it because I really don't like how that works. And I think a large part of it just does come down to that preference of one or the other. I do think it's also a little bit like, I haven't touched Bootstrap in a long time now, but even when I was using it, I wouldn't necessarily want to use it for everything I was doing. But if you needed to throw something together really quickly, it could work super well. So like Tailwind can help with things like that as well. So I don't think it's necessarily like, even if you don't really want to use it all the time, maybe there's use cases where it's the right tool. But I mean, personally, I'm not, my stance on Tailwind is generally I know why people like it and I get it, but it's not the right tool for me. And I think that's what we're seeing. And I just think we're seeing that divide where people are either enjoy writing with it or they don't, and then it just comes down one way or the other, I guess.
Yeah, that's probably, it's kind of really taps in nicely into what you just said here, Kevin, because Jeff is wondering, so I'm not a Tailwind user, but what do people not like about it?
For me, it's just well, part of it is I do help a lot of people that are beginners or sort of that are my whole thing is I try and help people not be frustrated with CSS, and sometimes they share their site with me and it's in Tailwind, and just debugging it, I'm like, oh my goodness, okay, trying to figure out what's going on here, and you go to your dev tools instead of trying to look at the classes and stuff, just because for me, it can become a bit of a mess, and it's I think it's one of those things that if you're using it within you see people saying, well, just use Tailwind, it's going to be easier or it's going to be faster, and then people skip out on actually learning. Like they'll start with Tailwind now, or they'll do it very early on before they really have a firm understanding of CSS. But it's just a different way of authoring CSS. So if you don't really get CSS, you're not really going to get Tailwind either. And I just find then it leads to, if you're not super comfortable with CSS, it leads to a lot of problems with just like over declaring things that you don't need to, and other stuff. And I just find like if that article that you shared was really good, just like comparing like the wall of classes that you get versus the semantic thing. And for me, yeah, that's part of it, is like if I'm going over 4 utility classes, I might as well just make a new class and put everything in one spot.
At this point, Christian is saying, well, maybe Tailwind CSS is what jQuery was for JavaScript last decade.
I see some parallels. I don't know if it makes things necessary. Like jQuery was really good because it made very difficult things possible. Maybe, I mean, some stuff I could see being easier with Tailwind, but especially when you start needing media queries and other stuff, I think it's a little bit different.
Yeah.
I don't know if I can draw a parallel to anything though.
Yeah, I think it's just very interesting to see this conversation, because I feel like we've been, I mean, doing this now for, we've been this, I know, decades now in web development phases, and then every now and again I see people coming into me and telling me, well, are you really using BEM? Is BEM? What? It's like we're living in 2024 now. BEM? Aren't we? And then they would keep going, saying things like that, kind of assumptions about how we should be working, right? Well, we just have scope styles, and we have CSS and JS, and we have styled components, and why BAM? What BAM in 2024? And I'm wondering at this point also, like again, when we have this divide, right? People kind of moving different directions. I mean, it would be kind of a wrong question to ask, oh, is BAM still a thing? Because for some people it is, and it's perfectly fine. For some people it isn't, and that's probably also perfectly fine. But there are this certain kind of assumption that people come with around how things should be, right? Which is always kind of nagging me a little bit, and I'm just like to complain about it publicly as much as I can. That was no question in there. It's more of a statement.
Yeah, I do. On top of that, though, I do think some of the solutions we see for CSS are trying, like you said, they see CSS not working the way they think it should, and so it's trying to make CSS into something it's not. With like some of the things with scope styles, and I use them within some of my projects, and I understand why people like that, and some of the CSS and JS solutions, but like there's a reason that CSS does have a global nature, and inheritance is a thing, and why these are good things, and they actually make for more maintainable code, and you can write a lot less code if you're using it properly. But I think the problem is when we're writing CSS, because of lots of reasons, you really need to come in with a different mental model than you would for doing anything else. And I think some people go, oh, it's not the same as what I'm used to. It's not working how I think it should work, so it's wrong. But I think that's the wrong way to look at it.
Okay, good point. So, dear friends, I just want to remind us all, so I'm very much welcoming your questions or anything that you'd like to ask. You're here because you probably want to know something. I see. When I look at Christian, I can tell. Yeah, he wants to know something out there. So feel free to bring up your questions if you like. Or we can also keep going. That's okay. That's fine. There was there is a note here in the chat. I don't think it's a question, but that's kind of a point around Tailwind as well, right? I think maybe kind of really to switching gears a little bit, it's been very exciting for me, like to see this notion of CSS grid coming along. This was like a really, really big deal to me. And then there was subgrid. But then there was, at least to many of us, a little bit disappointment around subgrid. And then there was a big question mark around masonry, which everybody was excited about, but then we're still kind of sitting there waiting. So I'm wondering just what the state of things is. And do you find, for example, for yourself, Kevin, that you kind of found peace with subgrid, and what are the problems that we have there? Because the implementation was not quite what people were expecting from what I kind of remember from, it seems like it was like a decade ago, right? What's your take on it?
Yeah. So yeah, for grid, I remember grid landing and then getting really excited for subgrid too. That was like, for me, was great. And it was in Firefox and we could use it. And I was super pumped because for me, that was what the grid really was about, was subgrid. And then obviously we couldn't use it forever because only Firefox supported it. I actually did a subgrid awareness month shortly before Safari ended up shipping it, just because I was like, people need to know that this is cool, and I want people to be like aware of it and some of the stuff it can do. And then Safari ended up shipping it. Now we finally have it in Chrome. So I do think we're going to start seeing more of it, because support's still not perfect. It's probably about 80% off the top of my head, but at least we can use it now. I do think that there's a slight raised complexity in using it, to use it properly, which is going to prevent people from using it. And it's one of those things where it's this really useful thing, but only like in the right situations. And then you start using it for rows, and it's kind of weird when you do it for rows because you need, anyway, I don't want to get into sort of the technical side because it's hard to explain without the visuals to go with it. But yeah, I see it being something that gains more traction, but not something that's this all in all out used tool on every site that we visit. But I do think it's slowly going to pick up steam again. I hope so anyway.
And masonry?
So I have some inside information on that because I talked to Jen Simmons recently, and they're sort of a little bit stuck. But I know that Safari is actively working on it now, so that's good. But there's actually debate now within the working group if it should be part of its own spec or the grid spec. So instead of like a display grid and then using the masonry, it would, I guess, be like a display masonry or something. So there's talk on what the best solution there is. So it's probably a long way away until we have masonry, sadly, because that's one of those ones where you're like, this, I guess when Flexbox happened and then grid happened, it's like, how did we wait this long to get these tools? Like how we had a language on how to change what a page looks like, and we never had a layout tool until now. That's crazy. And now you're looking at all these like common patterns that you're just like, oh, we don't actually have a good solution for that still. That's kind of wild. Yeah. But hopefully it's not too far away, because it would be so nice just to throw a masonry on there and it works and we don't have to think about it.
Without doubt, that would be nice.
Yeah.
Well, I do have to ask a question. I'm sorry. So it's kind of more like a joke, but how do we center a div in 2024 the right way?
I mean, it might be a joke, but Josh Como just put a really good article out on that.
I know. Yeah, this is why I'm asking. Yeah, so that's it's kind of something that we've been asking for, like, or wondering around for a while. And there was also a note on that from Johannes, who I think it's still a question. It's a very reasonable question to ask. But maybe a more kind of a better question also from Hope. If someone says, well, CSS is the easy part, do you usually interpret that as, well, this person knows CSS well and is very comfortable with it? Or this is a person who thinks they know CSS but doesn't realize just how complex and much there is in it?
That's a good question. Probably closer to the second one, just because I do think with CSS it becomes one of those things of the more you know, the more you realize you don't know. I've been making YouTube videos for 7 years now on CSS. I've taught in the classroom before that. So I've been like teaching development, front end development for a decade now, and I still learn new stuff all the time or make realizations on how, oh, that's why that worked that way for the past 10 years that I've been using it. I get it now. So yeah, I do think you sort of go through that phase of, oh, you throw a display flex on there and you get columns. It's easy. And then you start realizing that, oh, my columns aren't the same size. Why not? Oh, I can throw this on it, but then that doesn't always work. And then, so yeah, I do think if you think CSS is really easy, that you probably haven't done anything too hard with it yet. And I do often say that CSS tricks people into thinking it's easy just because it's a declarative language. And the first like 3 days of learning it, it's single property value, like background is blue, borders, whatever. Well, I guess borders more complicated
because me back in 2006.
Yeah.
That was very exciting.
Yeah. But then once you get past that, then you have like one new property that all of a sudden unlocks 10 new properties, and all of those properties are interrelated with one another, and understanding the relationship between different elements and different properties with different values and everything. And there is an inherent complexity to CSS that is sort of hidden a little bit.
There was a very good question that came from Bob here in the chat. You had some recent videos around named grid lines. I have adopted it for a couple of sites and like the approach. Ryan Mulligan's piece on it was really good. Can you talk about how this has changed your approach to the project that you do? Maybe kind of in general, kind of this overview of what you were also speaking about, just to give a bit of context to people who didn't watch it.
Yeah, so it's this idea, I got it, well, it turned out that I'd actually, when Grid first came out, I'd sort of played with it. I made a video on it like 5 years ago, and I forgot about it because Grid support wasn't there, I hadn't been using it. And then it was more recently, Stephanie Eccles did an article on how we can break out of the container type of thing using Grid. And then Ryan Mulligan has an article that sort of has different levels. So the main idea is, instead of having like a typical dot container or a dot wrapper, it's more about having a layout class or something like that, grid layout class. And that's going to set sort of your standard setup for you. So it'll have sort of 2 empty columns down the right and left that act as that buffer space to the edge of the page. And then you have the main area, and you just select all the children and say all the children have to live inside that column down the center. But then sometimes you need things that are a little bit wider. So you have an extra set of grid rows that are a little bit wider. So anytime you need that, you just put the right class on it, and well, now they're not living on that center area. They sort of break out to that next one, and you create multiple levels by doing that. The one issue with anything grid, when you have lots of grid lines going on, is keeping track of the numbers can sometimes be a little bit weird or annoying. You can actually name your grid lines. So you can say that you have your full width grid line, then you have a extra wide grid lines, and you just do a start and an end, and then you sort of name each one going all the way in to whatever you need. And then you can assign, you say, all of your content can just live in the grid column, and you give it the name, so main area or whatever. Then you could have your breakout has a grid area or a grid column of breakout. And then you could even do like a breakout right or a breakout left, so it's only going out one side or the other, and it's all just based on the grid line names. And yeah, I really like working that way now. I think it gives you a lot more versatility, and it's not these weird, like in those traditional layouts where you have like your main container and then you have that one image that's actually like full width on one side only. That was always kind of annoying to do. There's a few different solutions to it. It just solves like all of those problems. So yeah, I've been using it a lot and really enjoying it.
Excellent. I'm also going to be kind of dropping that link in here. I don't think I can find it, but I'll probably
might be
find. Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah, so that's nice. But that's also just give us kind of this really nice tools to be able to quickly navigate those things without the columns, without actually having to remember the numbers, because I always mess up. Well, I know 1 minus 1. That keeps me happy.
Yes.
Like,
yeah.
But everything else is now I have to calculate. Thank you so much, Kevin, for posting it as well. Question from Jenny: what do you think is the most important thing to learn in CSS, and what do you think is the hardest thing to learn?
Ooh. That's a really good question. It's one of the things I find hard with people. Ask me often for like roadmaps or like put all your videos into a playlist to get the right order, and I find I guess the most important thing is just that really early stuff where you're understanding, or I mean, what I usually say is actually get through like those early stages, especially you're learning the syntax, you're learning the box model, you're learning the different contexts of different things, the display properties and all of that. After you're finished sort of that and you've got your feet wet with it and you've had a chance to play with it, I think it's a really good idea to revisit some of those old lessons, not so much for the syntax, you figure that out, but you're spending so much time, yes, okay, there's a box model and there's the Cascade and there's all these other things, but you're not, some of it's sinking in, but not all of it. And because you're focusing on the syntax and like the 1,000 properties and 2,000 values that you have to learn. And so that's sort of what's taking a lot of your mental energy early on. So I think it's really worth going back over the fundamentals to understand sort of what things like, going over the different we have like formatting contexts that don't really get much attention. Stacking context is a little bit different. It's kind of weird. That's more, I guess, solving a specific problem though. But just, I think having a really good understanding of like the fundamentals of the different, when you do a display flex, what's actually happening. And, there's really good articles out there on that. Or when you do a display grid, how is it impacting things, and understanding, a display flex and a display grid are impacting the children, not the outside things. Whereas other display values change the outside things and not the inside things. And like, those types of things that I find most tutorials and other things don't really go into detail on are probably what have one of the bigger impacts of learning how CSS works. And I think a big part of it too is just using it a lot and just, I know it's silly, but the more you do it, the more you sort of run into the little problems that you need to figure out. Yeah.
Well, one thing that always breaks my head every single time, whenever I put display grid or display flex, justify items, justify content, align items, align content, place items. So could you maybe just once and for all just make sense for us? Do you have like shortcuts in your mind, like that you put somewhere like a sticky note where you said, okay, I do it this way and this is how it makes sense to me?
If I try one and if it's not the right one, I try another one.
Okay, so you basically just put everything and then you place maybe bang important as well on top, and then it kind of sticks.
Yeah. No, I do think, yeah, it is a bit annoying. Especially because with Flexbox, it changes when you change the flex direction. So then you sort of have to remember that at the same time. But just, I guess the main ones are just justify content, align items. One's this way, the other one's the other way. And then, yeah, actually a really good tool, a really good solution too is the dev tools now, because there's the little visual things. So if you're really not sure, open up the dev tools and just play with those little visual indicators. And then,
but Kevin, I still go and like, I will just to make sure, I'm just going to check everything, just to make sure, just so it sticks. It kind of usually works. Yeah, but probably a lot of unused unnecessary properties then. There was also a good question from Claudia. If a designer knows the basics of CSS but has been doing other work for the past 10 years and want to get back into CSS, what do you think that person should focus on learning?
if it's been 10 years, then grid for sure would be probably my top priority. Was Flexbox around 10 years ago?
That was 2016, wasn't
If it was, it probably wasn't very good, because I know at the early there was a lot of buggy implementations of it,
and different syntax as well.
Yeah,
for different browsers.
So, yeah,
that was fun.
So yeah, exactly. And so yeah, I think just figuring out Flexbox and grid would be very high priority. And then going, because the one thing that's nice about CSS I find is you can level up with it. So like, you don't need to learn CSS. You can learn the very the background colors, your borders, your padding, your margin. Then okay, now let's learn how Flexbox works or how grid works, and I can just focus on that, and I can do a lot with that. Okay, now I need to add a box shadow. Let's figure that out. But like, it's all additive. You don't have to learn everything at once. You can just sort of pick, oh, this is what I need to learn to accomplish this thing. But definitely, if you know the basics, I think Flexbox and grid, which weren't around back then, would be the two big ones.
Mm-hmm. Christian is wondering, with your deep understanding of CSS, have you ever played with the idea of getting involved in the CSS working group or web standards in general?
It's sort of been at the back of my mind a little bit, but I haven't actively done anything to get involved. So part of that's on me. I've just been so busy all the time.
I mean, 762 videos are not going to record themselves.
But maybe we'll see one day what happens there.
A good question from Bob, and that actually ties in with what I wanted to ask as well, because we've been kind of adopting, I would say, the IT CSS paradigm by hair robbers for, I don't know, a good decade, I think, right? And then, of course, Cascade layers came in and they kind of changed the perspective for how we should organize CSS. And I'm still wondering, just do we kind of replicate IT CSS with Cascade layers or not? And on top of that, Bob is wondering, I've been reading more about Cascade layers. It seems that there's a good way of keeping CSS organized. The project I work on are, however, very small. Is the value of layers in small projects?
I think so. So we'll start with that one because I think it's a bit easier.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I think because even for me now, when I do demos in CodePen that I'm going to use in a video, I take anything that's not directly related to what I'm trying to teach, I put in a not demo related layer that I just stuff down at the bottom. The two advantages of that are, first, it sort of just lets people know, okay, I don't have to worry about that if they're looking at my code after, because it's not related to what the focus of the demo is. But it also means that because everything else I'm writing is just in the regular scope, it has higher specificity. So I don't have to start worrying about like fighting with anything. I just know whatever I put in my demo world is going to work. So even on a small project, just like having all your resets in a reset layer, and then maybe your global styles or something, like I don't think you need to go all out, but just a couple of layers that can just help take away some of the conflicts that you might occasionally run into. In terms of bigger picture, bigger projects, it is something I haven't done too much of, just because the browser support hasn't. It's one of those things we can't use as a progressive enhancement. It's either it works or it doesn't in the person's browser, and you don't want all your CSS failing. So it's something that I think I've played around with it. I definitely had sort of my own approach, and I sort of, a little bit like you, my idea was just, well, this is how I traditionally organized it. So do I just keep those as my own layers? So I had, my reset, my global, my utilities, my components, et cetera, my layout layer. And then I'm like, well, do I need a layout layer and a components layer? Because that's not really, it's keeping it organized in a sense, but is it really taking advantage? Because it's not like you'd ever run into any issues there. So I wasn't sure. The biggest advantage is having utilities in the highest layer, just because then it gets important. So if you're putting a utility on something, even if it's a single class, you know it's going to work, which I think a utility should. But yeah, it's something that I think now that support's getting there, because it must be past 95% or close to it. I don't know. I'd have to look.
Yeah.
So now that I think we're entering the world now where people are actually going to start using it in production, and it'd be interesting to see if there's any sort of paradigm shifts or ideas that come up around using them.
Mm-hmm. We have a question also coming from 0033. I would probably shorten it a little bit. How do you feel about a lot of things which were previously only possible through JavaScript, but now they are possible with CSS and HTML alone? And on top of that, Johannes is wondering, what about refactoring legacy code as well? I think that's two separate questions there.
I'm super excited that I don't have to use as much JavaScript. You mentioned right off the beginning the video, my one JavaScript series that I had, which was on intersection observers, and the main reason I did it.
I will need to ask why in just a moment, but please keep going.
Well, I'll start with that, just because I made that because I've been using them a lot, because you can use those to add classes to things or to impact. I needed to do certain things that were about scroll behaviors, basically like scroll based animations. So you can, if you have like a table of contents that's sticky on the side or fixed on the side, you can like highlight what part of the page you're on and stuff like that using them. So like stuff like that, which sort of ties into the styling of things. That's why I did it, because I've been using them so much, and I'm like, well, it's super cool, it's super useful to style stuff, so it made sense for a video. Now we have scroll-based animations, so you can do basically anything that you could with those. Not quite, because it's a little bit different, but if you're just doing it for styling purposes and everything, to be able to do that without having to go in JavaScript, to me, makes a lot of sense. If the browser can figure everything out without having to have extra JavaScript, and it has its own API to figure all of that stuff out, and I can do it there, I don't see why not. And the syntax is really easy, and so it makes me really happy. Yeah, I think the more, as long as whatever it is accomplishing makes sense to be done in CSS, so it's related to how the page looks, the more we move to that, I think the better. Just because it always felt weird when there's stuff that you had to do with JavaScript that was mostly to deal with styling, just because that was the only way to do it. So for me, I'm happy. Yeah. And as I mean, and as far as refactoring legacy code, I'm taking that in. Do you think that's completely different, or do you think it's
Yeah,
related?
I think it's more like a probably. I would assume that this is also just a general question. So if you have, let's say, a legacy application which is written in CSS, I don't know, authored in the times when we used to have different types of flexbox syntaxes, right? Where would you even start today if you wanted to get, let's say, a clean, nice, state-of-the-art CSS? How would you even transition from that beast monster to something that's more manageable?
Yeah, I think part of it would be, I think similar to starting a new project is just taking, hopefully you're starting with a design or something in Figma or whatever your design software is, and you can sort of break that down and figure it out. You'd sort of want to do the same thing, but like, let's see what we have, break it all down. And then what can we change easily? And what, you have to do a big audit, I think, and figure out like what's easy to change. Maybe you have a layout where you can just a float based layout that's a 12 column grid type of thing that you want to switch over.
Ah, that was
There
good
might be a way
times.
of doing it without just flipping a switch, or it might be something you go, if I did that, it's going to break everything. So it's more about, it's a much bigger undertaking, so we're going to have to you see a lot of it where you're prefixing your classes, right? So you know that any new code is written with this new design system prefix or something, just so you know this is legacy code, this is new code. But yeah, I think it can be a big undertaking, depending on the site. Yeah.
Sure, of
Yeah,
course.
because sometimes you think it's going to be an easy thing, and then you make the switch, and all of a sudden, when that becomes Flexbox, you go, "Oh, that did different things than I thought it would." That the float
Yeah,
was accomplishing. Yeah.
totally. I mean, I also remember having conversations a couple of years ago around testing. How do we test CSS? And of course, we could do this diff where we actually have, let's say, a set
Yep.
viewport, and then we check, okay, the browser looks like this, and then we do run kind of a visual diff against the new version. Where are we there actually? Do you think like we have any, I don't know, new tools, new frameworks around like CSS testing?
Most of what I'm seeing is very similar to that still.
Mhm.
Yeah, just
Okay.
because I find CSS testing to be very, maybe there's people in the chat that know or
Mhm.
more on that side of things, or know something I don't know about, but I find a lot of it is um, it's hard to test because it's such, and even you pass a test and then you find out that if you shifted your viewport by 3 pixels, the whole thing falls apart or whatever, right? So like I find like, yeah, and that was one problem I've always had with testing, when because you have to just say like, we have to test at this size, but then if you're writing it knowing that this is the size that I need to make it look this way to pass the test, you sort of sometimes put in media queries or breakpoints at awkward places, or that don't work outside of the scope or between different scopes. So I've always had difficulty with testing things other than the manual way, which is time consuming.
Right. I actually find it quite fascinating that we still have an ongoing conversation about Tailwind in the Zoom. So that's like it keeps going. There was also a question from Manon, uh, which is interesting. Like, at which point do you actually allow yourself to use a new feature? When it has full browser support, but then you always have the older browsers not supporting it. So.
So yeah, for me, it really depends on the feature. So something like layers, scope is coming to CSS now, container queries, all of those things. If they don't work, it just doesn't work. And so that means the CSS fails. And especially if you're using layers and your CSS fails, the whole site is broken, which is not good. Whereas you can use other things like the scroll driven animations, where it means, that if the browser doesn't support it, there just won't be an animation. Now, maybe your boss or your whoever tells you it has to be there, so you have to figure out something and find a polyfill or whatever. But um, is it a progressive enhancement? Meaning, is it make the site better, but it doesn't break the experience for the user? Then I'm comfortable using it, even if it's behind a flag. I have masonry being used on my personal website for my course page. Nobody gets it because it's only behind a flag in Firefox. But I threw it in there because it doesn't break anything. It just, if it does work, it looks a little bit better. So yeah, that's the big thing. If it can be used for progressive enhancement, I really don't care what it is, and I'll throw it in there. Another one was like accent color when it first came up. Accent color would just make it easier to change some of the inputs colors. So throw that in there.
Mm-hmm.
If it works, awesome. If it doesn't, oh well, it's not the end of the world. It looks the way it would have looked anyway. And then if it's something that does break, then it's a lot about, if you know your analytics, it comes into play, knowing what your audience is. Or using @supports and making feature queries, so you can sort of say, if it's working, do this. If it's not working, do that. The only problem there is you do run into having, you're sort of doing double the amount of work to try and accomplish something sometimes. So that can be not everyone gets on board with that, depending, if it's at work and you're spending a lot of time to do something twice, it might not fly.
Right. Okay. Dave is wondering, do you find scroll-driven animation is powerful enough for production website instead of using GSAP or another JavaScript library or intersection observer?
For everything I've played around with it, yes. The big problem is browser support's not there yet, and the polyfill isn't perfect. So for production right now, no. But for, will it eventually get there? I think so. I think it's the stuff I've done with it, I'm just always blown away by it.
Okay. Tobias is wondering, in regards to design systems, is there a good way to force color preferences on an iframe or page level for testing light and dark themes? Switching in DevTools or the operating system feels cumbersome, especially for automated visual regression tests.
Oh, if there is, I don't know.
I don't know either, to be honest.
Yeah.
Maybe if somebody
Sorry.
in the room knows, that would be useful. But
Yeah.
that's a very good question to be. I mean, yeah, it's like it's very annoying. Kind of
Yeah,
switching it
exactly.
on and off all the time. Maybe there must be an app for that. Well, this is a business idea right there. So that might be, might be interesting. Hope G is wondering regarding legacy code problems would be an assessment on how much time has passed and if it will be easier to do a full rewrite for the entire site or a feature of CSS versus specific things to change and have some things running concurrently and prioritizing. So this is kind of the, the balance that we need to play there, more like a statement rather than a question. And Roland is saying, how and when do you consider your code to be good? I know CSS pretty well, I think, but I always doubt myself who doesn't. If I did it in the best possible way, there is. It's more like I don't know, like yeah, it's a religious question, I guess, at this point. Like, which point do you start believing in your code?
I think any developer that looks back on something they wrote a year ago is going to be ashamed of themselves a little bit somewhere. They'll find something that they're like, oh, why did I do that? I think that's normal. I think we always get better. We always learn newer, better ways of doing something or just improving on what we've been doing. Obviously, I think the big thing is like, does it work? That's a good thing. Is it causing any performance issues? No. You're probably okay then. I don't want to say that like that means you can't get better, but I think like that's sort of the baseline at least. If you do something that's working, but then it's caused you have a janky animation or you're animating something you're not that shouldn't be animated because there's better ways of doing it, then that's where you start learning. You might usually I think where you learn most is just because you do something, it works, you do something, it works, and then you get to like a case where you're trying to do something with what you've been doing that's worked this whole time that doesn't work, and then you realize like, oh, I have to find a new approach to that, and then oh, that would actually work better all the time.
That sounds like a story of my life.
Yeah,
But,
I think that.
yeah, so that's fair enough, fair enough. Good point by Paul, and a question at this point as well. Paul says, I've been a web developer for 25 years and have never learned a CSS preprocessor because I never needed to. Are newcomers learning pure CSS, or is the idea of writing without preprocessor dead now?
I think writing pure CSS is a good thing. I'm hoping, even if anything, because CSS is getting so much more powerful and better, that there's less push for people to feel like they need to learn something other than just seeing what other people are doing. Just because, like, as I said, I still use SAS, so like that's part of what I do. I stopped including it in my videos as much because I don't want especially beginners and other stuff, to feel like they have to learn that, because I was like, well, you know what, they probably don't. So I'll do videos on it if I'm solving a really specific problem that it does better than I could do outside of that. But because most of my audience are beginners, I don't want them to feel like that's the solution. Same with Tailwind. You know, I don't use it in my videos because you can, if you learn what I'm doing, then you could use that in Tailwind, whereas the other way around is kind of hard. But yeah, I think there's less. I think there's less of a push than there used to be, but maybe I'm wrong. Or except for once you get into the JavaScript frameworks, and then there's always, whether it's Scope CSS or if you're in React, there's the different CSS and JS solutions. So maybe there's that pressure on that side of things.
Yorti is wondering, and I actually would probably add a little bit on top of that question as well. The question is, do you know what we should be expecting from HTML CSS in the next 2 years? And I would say on top of that, do we have something that exists or lives on, I don't know, maybe for the last few years on Kevin Powell's wish list for CSS? I mean, what is coming and what you wish was coming.
Right. So what is coming? I'm trying to think off the top of my head. The ones that come to mind first are the ones that are sort of almost there already, but then we're going to have to wait a while before we use them in production. There's like anchor positioning, which if anyone's ever had to make, like, it's, if you have a positioned element, or say a positioned, yeah, you have a positioned element, but you want it like anchored to a certain thing. So say it's close, you have a drop down or like a pop out or a tooltip that comes out, but the element's close to the top of the page, it won't come off the top of the viewport. It would actually automatically switch and come down to the bottom of the viewport. So it's always in view, which is one of those things that's a really hard problem to solve in JavaScript that people just have to keep doing over and over. That's going to become something relatively easy with CSS. You can play around with it now, but I don't think, maybe it's only in Chrome. I'm not sure. I haven't done a lot with it. There's that. There's Scope is on the way. Scope's really exciting. It's kind of weird. It's not what you'd think when you think of Scope CSS necessarily, because it's a little bit like how custom properties weren't really variables in a sense, because it's looking at the scope, but within, like, you can say, like, you know, scoped within like selectors and stuff. Anyway, it's hard to explain again, but Scope's going to be, I think, something that changes things. Style queries, I think, are going to completely change things. I think that's probably the one that might have the biggest like fundamental shift in how things are written potentially. I'm just guessing, but I think that one's going to be really big, and it's really in the early stages right now. I know they're working on things for typography, the side of things. So Safari just shipped margin trim, which is, if you know, with collapsing margins, like, it lets us trim off the margins that stick out of an element, which is really good. But with that, in the original spec, there was another part of that that dealt with like how the lines, individual lines, are painted and stuff too, that they realized was a lot more complicated than they thought, because it basically lets you control where you're looking at on a line. Because right now, if you do, even if you take the margin off, your text doesn't always align. If you have an image, your text won't line up at the top of the image, and it's because the paint area is bigger, because you have to have room for like an accent or things that stick off the top of capital letters. So it would let you decide where you're going to trim the painted area, basically, for alignment reasons, which is going to be really good. But they found out it's a lot more complicated than they originally thought, so that's going to be a while away. But I think that's going to be one of those small improvements that everyone's really happy with once it actually happens. But that might be a while away. There's probably some big ones that I'm forgetting too.
And when it comes to your magnificent wish list for CSS in 2029,
yeah, I'm terrible at that, because I never come up with anything that's good, because I'm always just so excited by the ones that are there now I can play with. And then other people have these wish lists, and I'm always looking at them like, oh, those are good ideas, and then I forget about them by the time somebody asks me that. So I don't have anything really.
okay, that's fair enough. That's a good answer as well. There is also a question from Alejandro. I hope I'm pronouncing correctly. What about SAS? Do you think it will be over at some point in the future? Because a lot of stuff, we have nesting, we have scoping, what would be happening to SAS then?
Yeah, I think the main things that SAS, I think it's something that will stick around for larger scale projects still, within the right things. There's, with between loops and the functions, like custom functions that you can create, mix-ins. I know there is something being proposed, I think, that would be very similar to a mix-in for CSS. I don't know if it has any legs or where that's going. I haven't heard much about it recently. But yeah, I do think it still has its purpose. I mean, Miriam works on it. Miriam Suzanne, who's part of the working group as well. So she has an influence on both where things are in CSS, but also developing and working with Sass. So like, I do think there is stuff being worked on that side of things and how it works with CSS and everything else too. That's yeah, I personally think it'll still be around for a while, but maybe not in, at one point it felt like that's all anybody was using. Now we have Tailwind that sort of took away from that a little bit. We have vanilla CSS that's getting better and maybe reducing the need as much. So like it might become a little bit more of finding its niche rather than just being this all-encompassing thing.
And maybe before kind of wrapping up, I know there are a couple more questions. I always ask this question because it's usually something that could be helpful for everybody who is going to watch this later. Do you find any particular techniques or tools that you discovered maybe recently? I mean, relatively recently, I would say, which you think more people should know about?
Yeah, the one that's really stuck with me the most is what we talked about earlier about with the grid, setting up a grid instead of having like a typical container class and then having to close containers and sections and all of that, just having sort of your master grid and having the different sections defined in that, I think is super useful. It's embarrassing that I didn't start doing it earlier, considering how long I've been using grid. And that was sort of the idea, I think, for a lot of people when it first came out, is that as a master layout tool almost. But I think I think that's a big one. And I think just the idea, this isn't a new idea at all, but just leaning into letting the browser do as much work as possible. It's Jen Simmons coined the term intrinsic design, and I just see so many people fighting with the browser and like trying to just make things work the way it needs to work for that thing. And it's like, well, just put a flex wrap on it, and if it doesn't have room, it wraps down, or use your auto fit columns in grid, and then it just works. And like, it just seems to be that like people want this full control, and it's sort of realizing, just let it go. It's not a new concept at all, but just working with the browser when you're writing CSS, I think, is like that one thing that people need to do more of.
Okay, well, I think we have more and more questions coming in now, but we also like maybe 5 more minutes. Kevin, would you have 5
yeah,
more
of
minutes?
course. Yeah,
Okay.
no problem.
So there was one interesting question that also came from Christian here. CSS being one part of the story, HTML being the other, do you feel HTML has a bit of homework to do to level up with CSS in regards to things like dialog, popover, API, exclusive accordions, inert, and so on? Or is it that you're more or less happy with the state of HTML?
Yeah, I think I do think that there's a lot of discussion going on, and they don't want to get it wrong, I think. But yeah, having more native HTML elements would probably be a good thing. I think we're going to sort of see it now that because we have like the select menu that's being worked on, so it's sort of the same as a select, but you can actually style it. But then beyond that,
What?
I know that
Styling select menu? That
yeah,
sounds like a magic to me. So it sounds
yeah,
like a parent selector all over again. I don't believe it. I don't believe it before I see it. No, I don't believe it.
It works exactly the same, but it's stylable, completely stylable. It's pretty cool. There's the Safari is proposing now on it's a switch attribute for a checkbox that turns it into a toggle, or is it a toggle attribute? I don't remember. There's an attribute that you'd add to a checkbox that would turn it into a toggle visually. There's like default styling that would come with it, so it looks like a toggle instead of a checkbox, and then it would also have full control over styling it. I think there's work now. I don't know what the state of it is, but for what's it called? The dialogue that can work properly as an accordion. The only problem there is the animating it, which people want to do, which you can't do with dialogues. But yeah, I do think that there's some stuff that HTML could catch up on, but it does seem to be. I know it works differently. The way that what's the group called that does the HTML spec?
HTML? Yeah.
It works a bit differently than the CSS one, so I don't know a lot about it, but I do think that there's some pressure on them now to sort of these are common things that people keep reinventing. Why isn't it just a native feature that we could use? And I sort of agree on that. Yeah.
Sure. And there was also a question from Emily, and then just 3 minutes, and then we'll be wrapping up. Do you know if leading trim is happening anytime soon? I'd love if we could use it. It would solve a lot of problems.
Yeah. So that's actually the one that I was talking about.
All right.
But they've changed the name of it because it's doing more than just the leading trim. But yeah, so we got the margin. It was supposed to be margin trim and leading trim as part of the same spec. And then the leading one they realized is different. There's a lot more consideration. They're working with the typography companies because all of that information, they need to know what they have access to within the fonts and stuff. So it's being worked on, but they don't want to make a mistake because it's going to have some pretty big consequences once it's implemented. So they're trying to get it right. So it might be a while, but it's coming.
Excellent. All right. Wow, that's a lot of questions, a lot of answers as well. So that's fantastic. So dear friends, now while you're here, just one note I wanted to leave you with is that we also have a lot of stuff coming up. I'm very excited about this one per se, because I'm going to run a little free workshop for maybe like 2.5 hours, I guess, all around search UX. So that would be fun. I also pasted a link if you want to join in. We also have a lot of other things coming up, of course, as well. And if you look at the lineup for New York, we also have a very familiar face here coming up to New York to actually, share a couple of insights around CSS as well. So that would be kind of fun to join. Feel free to drop in if you have the time and stuff. We have a lot of things coming up, of course, and a few other smashing hours too. But for now, I think the only thing I want to leave you with is a word of wisdom from Kevin. Kevin, imagine people watching this very recording, I don't know, 7.5 years from now, like when the world of CSS is different and everything has changed and nobody is even talking about maybe Tailwind and whatever anymore at all, what would you tell them?
I think the most important thing with whatever's going on is just to stay curious and make sure that you're, enjoy what you're doing and learn. Like for me, obviously CSS is my passion. I love it. I want to always know more about it and dive into it. And part of that is one of the reasons I love it is just wanting to learn more. And there's always that opportunity. And I think whatever we're doing, no matter where the technology is, and if the robots are doing everything, we need to sit down and relax all day long, whatever it is. It'd be pretty boring if we weren't always trying to figure out new things and learn new things or whatever it is. So it doesn't matter what you're learning or what you're thinking about or whatever, but just staying curious, and I think is one of the most important skills anybody can have. Or maybe not
Future,
skill, but
dear people in the future. So that's a message from you in the bottle from the past.
yeah.
But for those people who are connecting today, right here, right now, thank you so much for joining in this time around. Thank you so much, Kevin, for taking the time to be with us and answering the questions and everything. I'm very excited to see maybe some of you in person this year or online in some of the other events. I'm very excited to see Kevin in person. That's seeing, because I always know Kevin from the thing here, from the screen, from the internet. It's the internet person. So maybe we'll meet this year as well. Thank you so much, everyone. Thanks for joining. Thanks, Kevin. Have a wonderful rest of the day, everyone.